line is only 2.5 miles away. Our present height of eye above the water. The real horizon would be beyond it. We're just going to use the top edge of Point Loma for that purpose. And you got this really romantic view of looking through the yards of sailing ships to bring the sun down horizon. So hard to beat that. In any case, we're going to do that. We're going to do questions first, and then we're going to do that, and then after we come back, we'll do a little bit of a review of what we talked about. Then I'm going to go through the sort of the narrative part of it. And because last time we went through the exhibit, this time I've got like 2 of the talks I did. I kind of shortened them and mushed them together. Hopefully that's not too discordant when I do that. And then after that, we're going to go into just the sort of navigation part of the plot and principles and things. Okay, so that's what the scheme is, or the plan is for today. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so I wanted to start with questions so that anybody that comes late can wander away have questions. And everybody benefits from questions. And I should just say it's typical, especially with a class this size, that we have people that have no celestial navigation, that have taken classes before, that have taken my class before. I took my class 30 years ago. And we have people that have had a long history with coastwise navigation. And then we have several people who just haven't done it at all. So we just kind of want to bring everybody along. And so those of you who've done quite a bit of this, some of you are just naturally falling in and helping. That's a really good thing. Okay, so jump right in and help. If someone doesn't look like they understand what's going on, try to be helpful. That's a really good thing when we have breaks and pauses and things. All right. Okay, so let's deal with questions that you might have. Can somebody start off with? Yes.
Sir, I'll start off with a dumb question. I was reading online, it's when you're plotting points, I'm only used to using the old MGRS system, but when you're plotting points, it's a smart idea to convert the seconds to a decimal point.
Okay, so that's a really good question. So the circle's divided into degrees, 360 of them, right? And degrees are divided into 60 minutes, right? So it used to be that it was divided, each minute was divided into 60 seconds. On any sort of plotting we're going to do, that's a really, really tiny distance. It's like way smaller than the width of a pencil, so it's not very useful. So most of the time you're going to see coordinates given in degrees, minutes, and tenths of a minute. Okay, so that's all we're going to be using here in this class. That's how the Nautical Almanac divides it up. And so that's, try and stick with minutes and tenths of a minute if you can. There aren't none of the stuff we really use in refers to seconds at all. Okay? So good question. Any other questions? Surely there must be other questions than that.
Is Brady or Sean here?
Oh, that's a good question. Is Brady or Sean here? Okay, yes?
So in your own words, why do we use the air navigation instead of...
That's a really good question, yes. Okay, so the tables for air navigation, I think, are a little bit easier. And the reading that I give you relies upon that particular source, so the two work together. And I'll say a little bit before I go into that about the reading that I gave you. I said read it 4 times. So the reason why I picked that book long ago to do is because if you read it enough times, you get the whole process almost by osmosis. It's not very well written. It's kind of flippant. But what I found is that there's a lot of books on how to do celestial navigation, but a lot of them, if not most of them, rely pretty heavily on formalized drawings and diagrams and mathematical expressions. And while some people love that, for a lot of people they just see it and there's a mental block. They just stop. They don't absorb it at all. So the thing about the Kittredge book is that whether you think it's badly written or not, reading something that's badly written doesn't necessarily lead to a mental block. Okay, it just say this guy is writing poorly, but nonetheless you can absorb it. So it's the best one I've found for doing that, but just by getting the process by osmosis. And Kittredge relies on 249, because you may have guessed he wants to demystify the process and make it as simple and easy as possible, which is what we want to do too, really. The 249 tables for air navigation, the process is a little bit simpler, for one thing, than the comparable marine navigation tables, HO229. The other thing is that you can go, only need those 3 books on your shelf to pretty much go everywhere. All right? The only limitation you have is that to to use the volume 1 and 2, the declinations limit you to, I think, 29 degrees, something like that. So things that fall outside of that, which doesn't include the sun or the moon or the planets and a goodly number of stars, the 229 tables are better for. However, the 229 tables are 6 big, fairly big volumes, and they take up a lot more room on the shelf, and they're more expensive to buy and carry around and everything else. And the process is a little bit more difficult, in my opinion. So that's why we do this one for this class. In the future, if you want to grab 229 tables and teach yourself how to do that, it's not that hard to do once you've got this process down. It's pretty easy to move from one to the other. They're nicer books because they're hardbound. They look like Encyclopedia Britannica, as you know, so they're nice that way. But it's not quite as easy to use. So they're more economical of space and money, and in your time, I think, to use the 249 air navigation tables. Did that help? Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. That's the question again. Another question? Yes.
It mentioned in the reading the sun's latitude. I don't understand how that works. It's like latitude is the thing on Earth and the sun is
Right,
on
right.
Earth.
Sure. Okay, so let me try and explain that a little bit. So
Please repeat the question.
the question was the book, there was a references to the sun's latitude, which seems contradictory because we don't often use the word latitude when we talk about the sun because it's something in the sky, and latitude refers to a coordinate of something on the Earth. So you're probably picking it up with a discussion about the GP, the geographic position of the sun. So that's the spot directly underneath the sun. If you were on the GP, the sun would be directly overhead, you would be standing in your own shadow, okay? So it's the spot that intersects the Earth's surface from a line drawn from the middle of the sun to the middle of the Earth, okay? That spot, because it is on the Earth's surface, has a latitude and a longitude, okay? So that's the position of the GP, and I think that's probably the reference you have. The sun, the equivalent in this imaginary celestial sphere, is the Greenwich hour angle for longitude and declination for latitude, okay? But we don't refer to longitude and latitude for celestial bodies. It's just either an hour angle or it's a declination, okay? So declination being the equivalent of latitude. Does that help? Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay, good question. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Sort of off topic, so if you don't want to spend too much time on it, it's okay with me. I've heard that B-17 bombers during World War II used celestial navigation. What did they do about the dip?
So what planes often used, and I don't know if this was B-17s or not, but I would think so. So the advantage to the horizon is that it's for the most part directly perpendicular to the zenith, right? So it's not quite, because the higher you are, of course, you have to allow for the fact that the horizon's further away, and that's a height by or a dip correction. So if you're in an airplane, you're way up high, that's a problem. Okay, so to create the horizontal reference point, they used a bubble, right? And so they're typically called bubble octants, and you used to be able to get them in surplus, and they look kind of like a weird kind of a camera, and you actually bring the image of the sun down on top of this bubble, and the bubble maintains level. Like on a submarine, the bubble is also maintaining level on a submarine. There's other ways of doing it. When they did celestial navigation in the Arctic, for instance, there's no horizon there. They used mercury, because mercury doesn't freeze. And so there's this kind of meniscus, but you could use mercury, and it's reflective. So you bring the sun down into, frankly, its own reflection in mercury, cut the angle in half, and that's the altitude of the sun. So that's a horizontal reference point. If you're doing this at home, and you live east, and you can't really get to a place where you can look at the ocean and see the horizon, another handy thing you could do is have a pan of motor oil, because that's really reflective. And you bring the image of the sun down into its reflected image of the pan of motor oil, cut that angle in half, and now you've created the altitude of the body of the sun above the horizon. So there's various ways of doing it, but the bubble method is what they used for airplanes for the most part.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions? Okay, so what we're going to do is, for all those of you who have sextants, take them with you, and we are going to go back to the Berkeley, and we're going to look through a sextant. So make sure that the filters both the horizon mirror, horizon glass and the index mirror are in place so they don't hurt your eyes, okay? We're not looking for accuracy, we're not gonna look inside out or anything. You just wanna practice looking at the sun through the sextant and moving the index arm to bring it down to the horizon, okay? So those of you who don't have sextants, you know, find somebody that will share them with you, and those of you who borrow the sextant, bring them with you, and we'll go out there and do it. So let's just, while the sun's still on, let's go to camp out to the other end of the Berkeley.
We need any paper or anything?
No, just take your sextant with you. We're not looking at the sun as it just touched the edge, right? So obviously when you're out at sea, there's not a mountain in the way, which is, you don't want there to be because you're using the horizon itself. So instead of bringing it down to this edge, right, you're bringing the sun down to the edge of the horizon. Now the sun is a disk, which planets are not, and stars are not. The moon is, but the stars are disks too. I mean, the planets are disks too, but they're so little, they're about like stars are. So you could actually bring the lower edge of the sun into coincidence with the horizon, or the upper edge. And generally speaking, it's better to use the lower edge, especially in the afternoon. I just find it easier because the sun's going down. So if you get your sextant 7 and the sun is poised just above the edge of the horizon, and then just be patient and wait, it will work itself down to the horizon, and right when it gets there, you click it, you make the observation. Margaret, I'll get you in just a second. Oh, okay. Let me get the microphone. Okay. We had that problem last time. Is it better? Yeah. All right. Okay. So if you're patient and you use the lower edge, and it's called the lower limb, all right? The lower limb, if you get it so it's just above the horizon and wait in the afternoon, it'll come down. People sometimes like to use the upper limb in the morning, where you have the sun just below the edge of the horizon, and you're patient, and right when the upper edge gets up, it gets there. It's a little bit easier to see the two things come into first contact than it is to capture the second that the lower edge leaves the horizon as you're doing it. That make sense?
So how much of an angular difference does that make in your measurement?
Oh, well, there's a factor that we allow for that. All the numbers, they're not based on one edge or the other. They're based on the dead center of the sun, right? As though there were a dot there. But there is no dot there, is there? So basically, one of the calculations deals with the semi-diameter of the sun, which changes depending on how high or low it is. But we'll go into that when we talk about working a site out. But that's one of the corrective calculations you do to get to deal with the fact that it's half the sun's diameter rather than one edge or the other. Okay?
What if we were in like stormy seas or something?
Right.
Where, you've got enough balance.
Yeah, it's a lot more of a problem then. Yeah. Sometimes you might just get a bare glimpse of the horizon, right? In which case you just got to get it then. Do your best. But yeah, if the sea is tumultuous, so that big seas running and only you occasionally see the horizon, that makes it difficult. Other conditions that make it difficult are fog, because you can't see the horizon, it's just all gray, so that's possibly a factor. Or a squall between you and the horizon, or just clouds that obscure the sun, or deep overcast where you don't see the sun for days. Okay, that's a problem. You can't see the sun at night, so you can't shoot the sun at night. And then also, if the sun is too low, like below 8 or 9 degrees, there is because here's the Earth, the angle, and if you're here and it's really low, like that, the angle that the sun's rays going through, it's going through so much atmosphere that it distorts it to the degree you can't make an accurate calculation. So if the sun's really low, that's not really a good time to shoot it either, okay? So it does need to clear the horizon by 9, 10 degrees or thereabouts at least. So there's various things that could impact or affect the accuracy of what you're doing, all right? So,
Otherwise, when it's, other than being below that 9 degrees or straight up and down, are there any other times that it's not a good idea?
I wouldn't say so. If it's a straight up and down one, that's a really good point, because that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen often. Once I was on the equator on the day of the spring equinox, so the sun was exactly at 90 degrees. And here's what it looks like. When you're looking out there, you're moving the sextant back and forth, and the sun makes a little arc like this. And you're also moving the sextant this way, it makes a little arc. If it's at zenith, you go all around the circle, and there's the sun right on the horizon. Right. Everywhere you look, there it is. So there's no one point underneath it. It's a really kind of unsettling phenomenon. But that is what takes place. It does make it difficult because if it's so flat, right, the area it could be in the whole circle, you may not have captured it exactly if the sun's not perfectly overhead. So it's nice to have a little bit of an arc to deal with because you can capture that low point nicely. Okay. All right. Excellent. Any more questions about that? Okay. And so far as the exercise yesterday, any more questions come to mind about that? Okay. Well, I'm gonna. So when we asked, when we went around, everybody said why they want to do this. How many people, some factor in wanting to learn how to do this has to do with just an inherent mistrust or unwillingness to rely entirely on electronic devices? How many people want to do that?
A little bit.
Okay.
It's just part.
Yeah, so it's probably a factor for a lot of people, but not the overwhelming thing. Okay, so that's good to know. So does anyone recognize the artist here by chance? It's Peter Bruegel, the elder, actually, of the two Bruegels. And does anybody recognize the parable that he's painting in this picture? Take a look at the sun up there. It's the parable of Icarus, yeah. Icarus it's in the Greek myth. His father made wings for him and his son and said, okay, you're gonna have a lot of fun with this, but don't fly too close to the sun. And of course, you never tell your kid to do something like that because that's what they do. So he flew too close to the sun and there he is falling down. This gets painted a lot by Bruegel. In fact, the Tempting Gallery has a painting that has this parable in there. But it wasn't just a myth, he didn't just make it up. It was a specific,
Ray,
yes.
help us with the name. I'm missing the Bruegel.
The artist was Bruegel, Peter Bruegel, yeah.
B-R-O-Y.
Brueghel. He was a Dutch artist. So what he was trying to paint here, or this is a pen and ink, it's not painting, but he was drawing upon the experiences written down by a famous traveler of his day. Now down in that exhibit, when you look at it, you saw all these books. Those were first edition voyage accounts. But I believe the earliest of those are 17th century accounts. The earliest oceanic traveler, or one of the earliest oceanic travelers in Europe was a guy named John Huygens van Lieshoten. And he sailed around with the Portuguese a lot. And he told about this story with this great India carrack in 1585 named the San Iago, which I believe is what's pictured here. And he wrote about it this way. He said, between the lands and by all the sailors' judgment, hard by the drowls of India, the pilot took the height of the sun and made his account that they were past the shallows, commanding the master to make all sail he could and freely to sail to Mozambique without any let or stay. According to Van Lieshoten, they were on their way from Lisbon to Joa, by the way. There were diverse sailors in the ship that likewise had their charts is what that word means, some to learn, others for their pleasures. Diverse officers, the master and chief boatswain, said it was better to keep aloof, especially by night, and hold good watch, for yet they found they were not past the shallows. Yet the pilot said the contrary, and would needs show that only he had skill and power to command, as commonly the Portuguese by pride do cast themselves away, because they will follow no man's counsel, and be under no man's subjection, especially when they have authority. So it was there. He would hear no man speak, nor take any counsel but his own, and therefore commanded that they should do as he appointed them, and that whereupon they hoisted all their sails and sailed in that sort till it was midnight, both with good wind and with fair weather. Moonless night, by the way, and everything was going well until the approach of the clear white coral of Europa Shoal. It was so sharp that with a force of wind and water drave the ship upon them, it cut the ship in two pieces as if it had been sawed in sunder. It was over in a matter of minutes. You know, all the planning and everything that went into making that ship, and everybody on it. Whereupon you might have heard so great a cry that all air did sound therewith, for that in that ship, being admiral, there was at least 500 persons, among which were 30 women, with many Jesuits and friars, so that as then there was nothing else to be done, but every man to shift bidding each other farewell, and asking all men's forgiveness with weeping and crying, as it may well be thought. So they pretty much all died. I'm not sure how he got such a detailed account if there were no survivors, but nonetheless, that's what he wrote about. So, very sad story. Obviously, the Portuguese pilot wasn't as good a navigator as he thought he was. And then 10 years ago, at one of the Vendée Globe races, one of the big racing boats, fully crewed, sailing in near the same area, with a full crew aboard, and in broad daylight, smashed into the same reef, near the same spot, at 17 knots, ripped the bottom out. It turned out that it was their GPS that sent them right to the same spot, okay? In broad daylight. So it isn't just a story from 500 years ago, all right? But it is kind of a moral lesson, about arrogance and placing too much faith on any one thing and being so certain of yourself. I'm not sure that Joseph Conrad and Joshua Slocum knew each other, but they both said similar words just a few years apart. They both said something to the effect that the reefs and coastlines of the world are littered with the wrecks of ships whose captains knew exactly where they were. So the point being that you never really do know exactly where you are, and there has to be a certain amount of humility associated with all of this. And that is part of the problem with electronics. They are so, I guess, seductive in conveying the belief that they're infallible, that you convey your trust over them completely. One more story about it. This was a story I heard on PBS a few years ago, where a woman left home in the morning, said goodbye to her dogs, went to work, came back, drove through the neighborhood, drove through again and again. The place that she left in the morning was an empty lot. And what happened was, a developer had been hired to demo a house at a given address, gave the address, but Google Maps sent them to this woman's address, and while she was at work, they eradicated her house. All of it was gone, right? Her dogs they took to the shelter, but she came home, there was nothing but a patch of dirt there. So all her possessions, all her clothes, all her keepsakes, all her books, the computer she'd been working home with, all of her food, all of her kitchen, everything was absolutely gone. And then the question became, well, who's responsible for this? Because lawsuits were going to happen. Was it Google Maps? Was it the contractor? Was it the demo company? Because when they tried to get it, it sent them to that place. They typed in the correct address to the house, but it sent them to that location. I don't know if it's still the case, but it was a while that when you type into Google Maps 1492 North Harbor Drive, you wound up at America's Cup Harbor, okay? And so, again, it's a case where there was a total reliance on this one sort of position finding. Didn't go so well in that case. I'm not sure how it turned out. I'm sure there were plenty of people to sue, and ultimately she got some kind of settlement. But it's a story along the same lines, okay? All right, so what we're going to talk about now, though, is we're going to go back in time a little bit, and we're going to talk about how people have thought about geography in different ways. So this is a medieval map. It's a TO map, and it's an image of the world as Europeans imagined it. This particular one was 1109, and as you'll see, it's got various allegorical references. The center of the map is Jerusalem, because of being a Christian map. They thought that was the center of the earth. You see the Red Sea, which is actually red, that band to the right. And in the middle is the Mediterranean with the Caspian and Black Sea, and then the Straits of Gibraltar spilling out here. And in the top of the map, which is not north, it's east, because east is up in a typical European medieval map, because it was believed that was the direction of the Garden of Eden. There are Adam and Eve and the serpent, right, up in the Far East. And surrounding it, it may be hard for you to see, but that green band surrounding it is the ocean sea, right? A little bit different than the ocean sea out there. There are the images of fish there, and it's not because fish were in the sea, they were, of course. But the reason why that image is there is because that was a symbol for eternity, okay? If you cross it, that's where you're going, to eternity. It was a very dangerous thing to contemplate. Another one of these, Isidore map, this was in 1472, only a couple decades before Columbus sailed. Again, it's a more schematic TO map. And it's a TO because it looks like a T inside of O. That's a little bit easier to recognize here. Asia to the east at the top, Africa to the right, Europe to the left, Mediterranean, and the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. And again, the sort of cryptic image of a fish in Mare Oceanus, which surrounds the known world. The most elaborate of these is this beautiful map. It's about 10 feet across. It's called a Hereford map, and it was composed about the year 1300. And again, the center of that map is Jerusalem. East is up, and you can see image of God up at the top. You have what looks like the impacted wisdom tooth to the upper right is the Red Sea. It's red, so it's always depicted that way on these maps. And what looks like a smiley face to the right is the entire Indian Ocean, because they wrote that they believed that the Indian Ocean was a closed sea. You couldn't sail in or out of it, because that is what Herodotus said about it. You can see at the very bottom the Pillars of Hercules or the Straits of Gibraltar, and in the lower left, England and Ireland, and so forth. So the whole known world surrounded by the ocean sea, which if you crossed it, you weren't coming back. Now, was there reason to believe that that was absolutely the case? If you crossed it, you weren't coming back? Well, yeah. In about 1348, a well-funded expedition of two Genoese brothers, made up of a fleet of galleys. They wanted to actually prove the Indian Ocean wasn't closed and that you could get into it, much like Vasco da Gama did years later. And they had enough food and for about a 3 years expedition. They even took seeds with them to plant and harvest. That's how long they were going to be gone. And they were going to circumnavigate Africa and go into the Indian Ocean. Now they believed, contrary to Herodotus, that they could do this because a Phoenician seafarer had done it more than 1,000 years before, after which a Carthaginian seafarer named Hanno had been said to do it. So they were going to duplicate that. So this was the most well-financed, funded, and prepared expedition capable by Europe at the time. So they sailed out through the Straits of Gibraltar, they turned left. It was the Vivaldo brothers, and no one ever heard of them again. And that was a pretty typical experience. No one heard of people that tried to do things like that, typically. Okay? So a serious problem in navigation. But there was also a sense that geography was a story, was a narrative, and that one of the purposes of exploration was to define geography, because if you could, if the world's geography was created purposefully by God, and it was an allegory for the Christian story, right? And so if you could find all these places, establish their relationship accurately, you could predict the second coming of Christ, right? Which was a good thing to be able to do, I guess. Anyway, it was full of narrative and full of these, not just relative references, but navigation was really following the story. At the same time as this, actually earlier in the 12th century, this map was composed by an Arab geographer named Al-Idrisi. He worked for Roger of Sicily at the time when Sicily was a Viking kingdom. It was also a very cosmopolitan place, and there were people from all over there, including from the Arab world. And in Arab geography and cosmology, there wasn't any particular superstitious aspect to it. This is a pretty rational depiction of space. Again, it's got east up, but you can see lines of latitude. You can see the Indian Ocean as more kind of like what it looked like. The Mediterranean is a lot more accurate, and you could actually see Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, the Straits of Gibraltar, the source of the Nile, and where the river flows into Alexandria. So it's a fairly rational depiction of space produced by what was then a fairly rational society, as opposed to Europe, which was fractious and divided and at war and primitive and illiterate and had been in decline for centuries. As opposed to that, the society that produced this, the Muslim world, was organized, systematic, more or less science-based. They were cohesive. They had a robust maritime technology. And they were capable of producing charts like this and sailing to far places of the earth without a belief that it was trying to serve the will of Allah or determine any sort of outcome at the end of the world. And it is probably the society that if you had shown up in about the year, I would say 1453, the year Constantinople fell, it was said these guys are going to run the show for the next 500 years. It certainly is not going to be the Europeans, because they had been in decline ever since the Roman age, and the whole European world was being nibbled away and chewed away by the Islamic world. And we're in decline, and all Europeans thought that their world was in decline, and if they needed any reminder, beginning in the 1340s, Black Plague would sweep over Europe, right? At the first instance of that, it wiped out approximately 40% of the population of Europe. So we went through our little plague with COVID, and trust me, it was nothing like what they had to endure in the 14th century. And it came back again and again every few years. The last serious outbreak occurred in the 17th century. So that was a reminder that they lived a fairly precarious existence, and one in decline. So you don't see that often in history where two societies kind of reverse roles, because now you would compare Western society with the Islamic world, and you would say we're fairly science-based and rational and technology-based, and we have a really robust maritime and naval power, whereas the Islamic world is fairly divided and fractious and fundamentalist and so forth. But in the time that this map was made, if you wanted to read Plato or Pliny, you had to read Arabic, because that was not available in any European language. The Islamic world depicted here contained most of the, if you consider part of the West, most of the West's universities, medical schools, astronomical observatories, great libraries, and many people were literate, and that wasn't the case at all in Europe. So what happened, what incredible earth-shaking thing took place to change that, to reverse the roles of these two civilizations, not the roles, but to reverse their relative orientations to one another so profoundly, okay? Well, a lot of people have come up with ideas for that, but many historians, some of the best ones like Carlos Cipolla, have come to the conclusion that the one thing above all others that changed the world and sent it on this trajectory we've been on for the last 500 years were these things, okay? The first time anything like this had ever appeared. These were, there's one sitting right out there, just so you know. In any case, what were these? These were European-style sailing ships, and what made them special, what made them different? Well, they had heavy commodious hulls that you could carry a lot of cargo with, and they could survive big storms. They could also sail in light wind, which ours does pretty well, actually. They had artillery, seaborne artillery that made them fortresses, so that no other man of war of any other society could stand up to any European ship armed with naval artillery. And that was proven over and over again. It gave them immense advantage and allowed Europeans to basically to take over the world's oceans. The only thing one of these had to fear of another kind of ship was one of their own kind, right? So they could go anywhere. They were almost impervious to attack by any other kinds of vessels. But the third thing that was the most, and it was the most important of all, and the most earth-changing of all, and the one that gave them an immense power, was they were able to navigate. Not just to get to one place to another, there was something even more powerful than that. They were able to create maps, just like you did, but their maps had one significant difference. They were saying, this is mine. This is mine. That used to be yours. Now it's mine. Okay? And all the world was divided between the only two European nation states that had oceanic capabilities by Pope Alexander VI in 1492, and then an adjustment made in 1494. That just changed everything. It's why in the Americas, people speak Spanish everywhere except Brazil, because that line cut through Brazil. And why in the East, people speak Portuguese. So, how did that again come about? Well, it came about through several processes, but they included rationalization and, the use of instrumentation. Initially, as in this map drawn by Ptolemy, direction was defined according to the winds in the Mediterranean world, which was the center of the European seafaring. And these winds all had qualities that could allow you to distinguish one from another: hot and dry, cold and wet, so on and so forth. The Sirocco, the Meltani, and so forth.
Well, I was just like, this is drawn by Ptolemy, you said, right?
Yes.
And he's back like ancient Greeks, right? So how did he get that good? Like, that's a recognizable map.
Right.
And then how do we evolve?
Well, again, it is, but it's showing you actually the Indian Ocean, and that's a closed sea, so he got that wrong.
Well, he got it wrong,
Yeah.
but like you can see where India is, you can see
Yeah,
where
yeah,
like
yeah.
the Africa, and you can like
Sure.
so how did we get that? Or first map you showed us,
Yeah, how did it go from this,
Yeah.
which is fairly rational, to
Yeah.
this sort of crazy, narrative thing? Well, because at the time when Ptolemy did this map, Europe wasn't in decline, actually, and was more rational. And it did have observatories, and Alexandria was a port from which ships went out to the known world and gathered that kind of information, brought it back to the Museum of Alexandria. And it was one of the foremost scientific institutions of its day. So understanding direction was at first a difficult thing. The artillery, this is a navigation, so yeah, let's go back to Ptolemy then.
So the question I've got is, I didn't think that the maps came about until they came out with the Cartesian coordinate system.
No.
No,
Actually,
that would give them scale and things.
sure. So there have been, and we'll get into this, there have been grid systems going back to the ancient world. Eratosthenes, for instance, produced a map that had latitude and longitude on it. Now, it wasn't always the case that latitude was evenly spaced or longitude was evenly spaced. Sometimes the line just went through important points, and that's how they determined their grid system.
Okay.
But almost all societies make maps, but it was only really until the early modern world that they began to be truly rational depictions of space in terms of regular, geometric, predictable, depictions. So, and again, they were doing this long ago. So artillery, that was one of the few places where instruments were used. This image to the right from 1128, the Chinese Demon Cannon, it's the first image I know of showing a gunpowder weapon being used. Because this guy's actually holding it, it's probably the first image of someone being killed by a gunpowder weapon also. In any case, they gave immense power to knock down castles and fortresses and sort of change the nature of warfare. But when you put them on ships and you could move it around, that magnified the power of whoever had ships like that exponentially. Also with navigation of all kinds of contraptions, and almost from the beginning, longitude was an issue. This device that's shown here was called a cosmolabe. And in 1610, when Galileo got his hands on the first telescope and aimed it at Jupiter and saw that Jupiter was surrounded by moons, particularly 4 big ones, he noted 2 things. One, this looks exactly like Copernicus said our solar system looks like. So validation for the Copernican system, the heliocentric universe. The second thing he says, that thing is a clock, and I can use that to find longitude, right? And that was what he wanted to do. And so he set about watching and logging the movements of Jupiter's 4 largest moons, and indeed it becomes a clock, and indeed it could be used to find longitude. The problem is you need a telescope of at least 30 power to be able to see the moons of Jupiter, and on the rolling deck of a ship that's almost unusable. Well, it is unusable, it's totally unusable. So for 100 years, people were developing contraptions like this, like enclosures that were gimbaled, so somebody could sit in one with a telescope and get a look at the moons of Jupiter. It never quite worked. In terms of that ongoing rationalization, the Carta Pisana, which we have a copy down there, is one of the earliest maps that rationalize space. It doesn't have latitude, longitude, but it does have loxodromes, which reference direction. So they didn't have parallel rules in those days. They just picked a course that looked close, was parallel to one of the loxodromes and followed it back to the compass rose. But what is interesting, I think, about this is that this chart came out shortly after the widespread use of the compass began to be used in Europe. And the compass, I think I said in our walkthrough, was the first instrument in history that measured a quality of nature humans couldn't sense, magnetism. You can't sense magnetism. But yet, this device measured it. No one knew what magnetism was. They wouldn't know what magnetism was for a couple hundred years or have any idea what it was. And yet, merchants and sailors were willing to trust their ships and cargoes and their lives to this mysterious device that measured something no one knew what it was, and used that to define direction. And that direction, the winds don't always blow from a perfect 360-degree circle. They come where they come from. But with a compass, you can divide the circle up into 360 degrees, and you can rationalize the space. And if you can rationalize the space, and you can use that device to sail from one coast to another when you're out of sight of land and arrive predictably at a landfall, then you can actually perform a kind of magic, and you can visualize that space in a way that can be used predictably and abstractly, and you start to have maps that are able to reflect that quality. The Carta Pisana being the first one that I know of. And so people began to use these maps, starting to use them as reference points, where beforehand they had relied upon rudders and maps that weren't necessarily rational. So in this instance, you have a gradual metamorphosis. If you look at the lower left, that's Pierre Garci's rudder of 1520. A rudder is a short even of the word routier, and it's just a set of sailing directions. We still have sailing directions and use them, written graphic descriptions of what you're seeing, and advice on where to go and how far to stay out without running aground, and where the wind's going to come from. All these things are written down. Well, that's all they used to have, was sets of directions for going to places. And in the upper right, you see another rudder from 1480 with a sailor lowering a lead line from the ship to get the depth. Okay, so these were directions that went from narrative form to graphic representations. And so in the upper left, that was the first modern atlas of sea charts ever produced, Johannes Lucas Wagner in 1585. And what's interesting, even in Wagner's maps, things are shown out in proportion to their importance. If it's a very wealthy port, it's bigger, right? If it's not so wealthy, it's not so important, it's littler, it's maybe pushed aside. So there's definitely a subjective quality to the maps he produced, but these are the maps that both sides in the Spanish Armada were using, to fight their way up and down the English Channel. And to the right, a map in the late 17th century, produced by Grenville Collins, who was the first modern hydrographer. He was the first hydrographer of the Royal Navy. And as you see, this is a map of the Scilly Isles. Did I pronounce that right, Margaret? Yep. Okay. So it's a place that has seen its share of tragedy, with ships being destroyed and whatnot. So having a good map of it is important, but it shows it in rational form. So and the gradual understanding and mastery of this ended up being able to give people special status in the seafaring world. So initially, treatises on navigation, like you see here by Wagner's treatise on navigation, these guys that are, and by the way, I just want to point out, that's a really nice cartouche, right, on that thing? There you go, okay. In any case, they're surrounded by these guys with this whole arsenal of really cool looking instruments that most people today didn't know what they did. It just endowed them with this quality of wizardry that they're able to use these things to get ships from one place to another. So in an age where social mobility was pretty much defined by the class you were born into and the occupation you held, seafaring was one of the few ways in which you could elevate your station, no matter where you were born, if you could get yourself on a ship and learn how to do this stuff, okay? So master that, just as we saw in Van Lieshoten's story about the pilot, and about all the people that were on the ship that were brought along their own charts and their own instruments because they wanted to learn how to do this. That was a pathway to social mobility. So you got social mobility by geographic mobility, because you can improve your circumstances by going from one place where you didn't have good prospects to another where they're much better. But also, if you learn this technique of how to navigate from one place to another, then you had special qualities that were valuable for the whole enterprise and empire building. So much so that there's another treatise on navigation, Hood's Mariner's Guide from 1592. And what's going on in this little drawing is everybody is so fascinated with their charts and their parallel rules and their dividers and the Grove and the astrolabe. This is a whaling ship off Spitzbergen, right? And they're all so obsessed with that. There's a guy with a cross staff taking out to the sun. What they're not noticing is nobody's seeing the whale that's off to the left, which is the point of the whole thing to begin with. So this is really it's a sort of another morality play about let's not lose sight of what we were really supposed to do. Increasingly, numeration was beginning to be a defining feature. Now, at this time, only military engineering, mining, and navigation were fields in which instruments and mathematics were deemed even useful, right? Instruments, particularly, Aristotle said, were useless to any scientist. They got in the way of human observation, which is what all science is based upon. So any results determined by instruments, and he didn't think much more of mathematics, was flawed from the beginning and not to be trusted. But that didn't work with navigation. So this is a set of declination tables of the sun by Martin Cortez in 1545, Cabrillo would have had access to this to do noon sights, okay? Now, if you notice, the numbers are in Roman numerals, okay? The Spanish at this time did all their calculations in Roman numerals. Didn't use, these intelligent wizardry guys that used all these instruments to it being a more systematic and mathematical practice. So it comes down here to something that's showing a map, still lots of instruments. Then you get up with Norwood's system of navigation, where art is suppressed. So it goes from the art of navigation, where art is elevated, it's a mysterious, magical wizardry kind of thing, down to navigation, which mentions both, to a system of navigation, where the art part is being muted, to where art's not mentioned whatsoever in Neville Maskelyne's Nautical Almanac of 1769, the first nautical almanac you could use to actually find your longitude. So this proceeded into a more and more of a rational course, ultimately resulting in expeditions going forth from the European nations, ostensibly for scientific purposes, but also to kind of by rationalizing the world, they were rendering it into European form and expanding empire. The most noted among those would have been Captain James Cook, and his voyages, 3 voyages, first on the Endeavour, then Resolution and Discovery, Resolution, and Adventure, looking for things that mostly he never found. Okay, he never found Terra Australis Incognita, never actually had a successful observation of the transit of Venus, never found the Northwest Passage. So it doesn't sound like he had a very successful career, yet he is regarded as the greatest navigator of all history for the stuff that he did find and the stuff he did. But there was a strange thing which took place, because when they got to Polynesia, everywhere they sailed over this vast surface of the earth was populated by people who spoke the same language, had a similar culture, and kind of knew where all their distant relatives were all around the Pacific. And there was a special caste of people, referred to as navigators, that could find their way, so they said, across vast distances of ocean. The thing that seemed odd about this to Europeans is that these people had no writing, they had no metallurgy, they had no instruments, they had no system of mathematics like the Europeans did. They had none of those things. They didn't even have a rational understanding of the space they moved through, like Europeans had developed through that whole long process. So it was very mysterious. A lot of people for a long time didn't believe that people could actually do this, but Cook did, because he had with him a navigator from the island of Raiatea named Tupaia, who sailed on the Endeavour. And at one point they were sailing along, and he and Cook and Joseph Banks began to conduct an interview with Tupaia, because Tupaia was interested in how they navigated, because none of what they were doing made any sense to him whatsoever. And they said, well, how do you do this? Where's all the islands? And so together they produced this really strange map, one of the most bizarre maps in all of history, called Tupaia's chart. And in it, there's about 80 different islands in it, and none of them are quite in their exact places, and their sizes are somewhat problematic, but most of the big ones are there. Fiji, Tonga, Hawaii's not there, but New Zealand is, Easter Island, Pitcairn, Gambiers, Australs. And the thing about it was, and he knew the courses for all of those, and he said, and he implied to them that this doesn't work. But they generated this map, and for years, geographers said this proved that the Polynesians couldn't actually have known where they were going. They got to these islands by drift voyages, because this map is horribly inaccurate, and if you tried to use it, you would miss those islands you were headed for. Okay, except that they did use them. And the problem is this was a map drawn from a relative reference system in an attempt to reconcile the differences between the kind of maps you would use as in the medieval period, rudders and things, with the rational maps that Europeans were using. Tupaia couldn't make sense of modern charts any more than at that point someone other than Cook, who was a great pilot as well as a great navigator, could make sense of the navigation that Tupaia was using. And in his system of navigation, the canoe was the center of the universe. You set off from your destination, you noted the amount of leeway you had, and from that point on, It was your job as a navigator to draw the island you were aiming for towards you. The islands moved. They all moved relative to each other. Okay? So in similar fashion to, you may think that sounds crazy, but the navigation you're going to use all throughout this course, the Earth is at the center of the universe, isn't it? Right? We talk about the sun rising and setting. We don't do anything any different, right? That's what Tupac was doing in his conception of space. That means because they did not have a compass, and so they had to memorize the star courses between these various islands. Now that means to go from one island to another, you watch let's say Scorpio, if you know how that looks, you see these stars appear above the horizon, one after another, they rise over the same spot. And then you have that over your stern going back. Okay, and that works fine for any two islands, right? But because of current, you're in water that itself is moving, you can't sense that it's moving, and so the place that you're aiming for one island, it might on a modern chart be a reciprocal of another, but you can't actually aim for the reciprocal or you'll be swept down current. So mentally, we do this through drift and set problems where we essentially allow for the ship's course, but in Tupia's system, the islands moved. And because they didn't have a compass, they had to memorize the star courses for each of those. And the reciprocal. Okay, that doesn't sound so bad. But without a compass, you had to memorize the star courses for all the islands that you knew about. And it's a factorial expression. Okay? So, to memorize the star courses between two islands, it's just 2 times 1, 2 courses. For 3 islands, it's 6 courses, 3 times 2 times 1. For 4 islands, it's 4 times 3 times 2 times, 24 courses for 4 islands. For the 80 islands in Tupaia's world, it's something like 10 million bits of information that you had to have committed to memory just to replace a compass. So it's an enormous achievement in human memory and the ability to interpolate what you're seeing out on the ocean and translate that into
Did
sailing
they go
directions.
island to island, or did they stop at another island on the
Well,
way?
sometimes you can't. I mean, sometimes there's 1,000 miles between islands, and there's no place to stop.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Yeah. So if you could go to island, and you could actually note the presence of islands that you couldn't see by the way waves refracted around the islands, or the way the clouds look overhead, or by birds, or you could expand the targets. So you could sense an island before you could see it, because maybe it's birds and things like that. But you could go from island to island. But some of these courses they did could only be done if you could sail hundreds, if not thousands of miles across open ocean without any sort of sighting of any land in between. It's an amazing phenomenon. The Vikings actually never had to go more than about 80 or 90 miles on any given course to be able to get to the Americas and back. These guys had to go thousands of miles. Question, Sarah, did you have?
I was just wondering, like, how did they know there was an island to sail to in the first place?
Well, the
You
first.
can't see it itself.
Yeah, the first time out you don't, right? Just like Columbus, he didn't say, "I'm going to go find North America," right? He didn't know it was there, and it was a nuisance when he did find it because it was in the way. But once you know that an island's there, an island, how do you find it? Well, we're going to go into this, but there's a number of techniques that they use to be able to do that. But one of them, at least, seems an almost impossible feat of human ability to sense direction. At least the Micronesians. We're not sure how the Polynesians did it. We know how the Micronesians do it because some of that system survived enough into the recent times to be captured by anthropologists. So yeah, but there was it turns out for a long time they thought that Polynesia was colonized by canoes drifting downwind and down current because you couldn't sail, that would be the easy way to go. So from South America across. It's really dangerous to do that. You really want to beat the weather because if you're sailing, for every mile you sail downwind, every day you sail downwind, it takes you 5 days to get back. If you run more than 20% of the way through your food supply, you'll die because you'll never survive the trip back. But if you sail to windward, all the distance you cover in 5 days, you can gain back in 1. So it's a lot safer to do that. So a lot of the sequence of colonization of the islands were actually deliberately sailing to windward in the canoes. Okay. So that's one of these. I don't know, maybe I should do the phone. I tell you what, we're just going to hold the other one off till next time because we really do need to get to some of the stuff. Okay, any questions about any of this?
I had a quick one though. You know, you said how they use certain stars where they'd rise or fall
Mhm.
as to their points of navigation.
Yes.
Would they also accommodate for seasonal changes where the currents and the winds would come slightly from different directions?
Oh, yeah.
And that actually would be a different star? That would
Well,
add
it would
even
be-
more information.
The way to look at it would be, because you would be accounting for seasonal differences in currents and things like that, it would be the same as using a different compass course, right? And so they would use a different star because that is the equivalent in our terms of a different compass course. And again, if the wind's blowing foul, if it's setting you off for leeway, you have to account for all of those things. And your course corrections have to take that in.
So I was wondering if they adjusted for that, or they just always started certain voyages from certain times of the year.
Well, it was, so I think both of those, because once you're out there, you have to cope with what you get, you know, you can't. But definitely the case that you would wait for a fair wind, which Europeans did as well. So you'd want everything in your favor, always. But once you're out there, you just have to be able to get where you're going, regardless of things change, change in the meantime. But the system was resilient and flexible enough to be able to accommodate any number of changes like that, and work them within their abilities.
We've been getting a little bit ahead here, but when Captain Bligh was set adrift in his longboat,
Mhm.
was he given a sextant?
He was, but he was not given a chronometer. Okay, that chronometer ended up going to Pitcairn Island, and then had an exciting life. I can go into later, but no, he wasn't given a chronometer. He wasn't given much actually. So, but just with a sextant, without a chronometer, you can find your latitude. And Bligh was an interesting guy. He's in this 23-foot boat crossing 2,000 miles of ocean, and all the islands he's sailing through, they're pretty defenseless, and the people there would like to kill and eat them. So it's a pretty hair-raising situation. Just getting to civilization was the goal. Bligh decides to do charts like you were doing here, and do surveys and chart all the islands. He was still continuing to be doing, a cartographer's job in this open longboat, sailing thousands of miles under these precarious circumstances. So, let's get to it.
One more follow-up question on Captain Cook.
Yeah.
Did he, in his writings, did he write about any of the Polynesian navigational practices?
He mentioned that he believed that they knew. So the problem when they got to Tahiti was the Tupaia knew where all those islands were. He himself knew how to get there. He had not been to many of them. And most of the great voyaging was over by then. So that there were voyaging canoes kind of rotting on the beach, but it had been a long time, generation, since anybody had actually conducted one of those long distance voyages. So he was having to reconstruct he was having to come to a sense of what had happened based upon the stories he was getting by the people that he interviewed. But he believed that they were able to navigate from one place to another like they said they were. Not everybody believed that, but he did.
Wait,
Uh-huh.
Going back to the Ptolemy map, when was that first seen?
I think Ptolemy was, if I'm not mistaken, 4th or 5th century originally, I think. But I'm not positive about that, Bob. I'd have to check that out. It was a really commonly reproduced map right up until, even after the discovery of the New World, people were producing Ptolemies.
That was a major advance.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So with the Micronesians, with navigation, in a sense, aren't they kind of working backwards? I mean, because the moon influences the tides, and then there's the magnetism. I mean, indirectly, those things are affected.
Well, they didn't have any comparable thing to magnetism. And there aren't many tides. The tides in the central part of the Pacific, they're a matter of inches. So they're not a really big factor. There are places where they are a factor, like in an atoll, where you've got a ring of islands that are the size of San Diego County, and there's only like 7 exits. Well, yeah, the tidal current there can be fierce. But for long distance navigation, tide really isn't so much a factor for them. It was a huge factor in Northern Europe or in the North Atlantic, places like that, but not so much where those folks were.
They
Okay.
had Polaris.
What's that?
They had Polaris.
Well, some of them did, like the Hawaiians did, and but not you can't really see Polaris from 18 degrees south in Tahiti, but right about not too much past the equator and it's gone. You can see the Southern Cross though, and that's helpful. Uh-huh.
Silly question, but how accurate is Moana to this whole?
It's a really sweet movie, you know. I love it. Yeah.
It's all I know about it.
Yeah. It's really a nice movie. I'd say emotionally, it's absolutely accurate. Okay. All right. Okay. So we're gonna go to actually talking about using instruments and things like that. Okay. I'm gonna close this up, and I'm gonna use the whiteboard again. And that is determined by position, and a position can be described in several ways. A latitude and a longitude is a position, okay? And so position is important. So there's location is one thing. Another thing we deal with all the time is distance. And the distance we use is what? What's the unit of distance that we use the most of? Nautical miles. Right. And how big is a nautical mile?
1 degree of latitude.
About, it's 1 degree, one minute of latitude. It's about 6,060 feet, yeah. And that is 1 minute of latitude. Okay, so it's bigger than a land mile is, right? Why is a land mile different? Because Romans are shorter. Yeah, because when they were well, okay, so the problem in Rome was they had these roads, and they would march a legion along the road, and you wanted to know if the head of the legion was here, where was the tail of the legion, right? And so they did that in terms of miles, and a mile is 1,000 paces right and left from a typical Roman soldier about the time of Vegetius. And they worked really hard at regularizing that, marching in regular fashion, so that they just could control the movement of troops. So your speedometer on your car, and you might get a ticket based on the fact that, you know, you thought that those soldiers had longer strides than they really did, right? Okay, so location, distance, and direction. And direction is by the compass, but there's really kind of two directions we work with a lot. Those are magnetic and true. True is based upon the polar axes on which the Earth spins, okay? Magnetic is based upon the Earth's magnetic field, which isn't quite so lined up as that. Okay, so when that compass lines up, there's always a difference, wherever you are, between true north, or true anything, and magnetic north. And that difference is called magnetic variation. So if that were steady all the time, that would be great, but it isn't. It changes. I think Bob was pointing out he has a chart from, was it like 30 years ago?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, 30 years ago, and the variation was about
14.
It was 14, and it's, what is it now, 11 or so?
11.1.
Yeah, so it's changed by 3 minutes, right, or 3 degrees, 3 degrees in about 30 years.
1970, it was 15 minutes.
It was 15 minutes, okay. So that it changes. In fact, several times in the Earth's geologic history, the North and South Pole had just flip-flopped completely, and North became South and South became North. Now, if that happens on your next trip to Catalina, it's going to be really disruptive to your plans. But it's there, it's a reference point, but it's not as variable or as sort of squishy as direction by the winds, but it does change. And so we also deal with speed, which is simply distance over time, and we measure time in the same way we measure time anyway. And speed is done in nautical miles per hour. We call it knots, okay? And it's called that because the way they measured nautical miles at one point was you threw this sort of drogue over the stern of the ship, and you had a timing glass, and you flipped it, and the drogue took hold in the water, and it pulled the line out over this reel, and knots in the line, carefully spaced to represent, a nautical mile, would go shooting over the stern, and then when the sand ran out of the glass, you stopped it, and you saw how many knots went by, and that's how fast you were going, okay? People began to use those in the late 18th century, actually a little bit earlier than that. Before that, they just threw a piece of junk over the bow, and they timed it, how long it took to get back to the stern. But because there weren't accurate clocks, they used their heartbeats to time it. So not quite so precise in that regard. Later, there were devices that spun around, and they recorded the amount of distance you ran in a dial. Those are typically called taffrail logs or Walker logs. But anyway, it's all speed and distance. And so what a lot of this boils down to is your location. and how that location might be affected, how that location changes at different times depending on the course you sailed, the speed you sailed, and so on. So a position is also called a fix, okay? And a fix is any two or more lines of position. Now, it isn't necessarily and always a precise position because it might be it might be a running fix, which involves somewhat of a guess or a guesstimate based upon how far you think you've gone, the speed you think you've gone since the last time you had an actual fix that we're sure about. But two or more lines of position. So a known latitude and longitude, right? There are two lines that cross each other. That's a fix. If you say I'm at the corner of 3rd and Main, that's the intersection of two streets, that's a fix too. Two lines of position. You can have more lines of position than that, but you need at least two of them. So, something to white.
There's information on the backside.
Is there? Okay. Get rid of the sun here. Whoa, it's blowing away from me. Okay, let's just gonna scoot this back. How about that?
There's brakes.
Oh, there's brakes. Okay. Well, this is a fancy thing. I didn't know there were brakes. Okay. And, okay, so things in my hand. Okay, so a line of longitude, a line of latitude. And if you know what those are because you looked at your GPS or something, or you just knew what they were, that's a fix. But there's other sorts of lines of position as well.
Use your microphone.
Other lines of position as well. Thank you. Need to be reminded of that. Okay. You can actually determine your position by bearings. Okay. A bearing is a measurement you take, typically with a compass. And in one way of thinking about it is it's simply the course from where you are to the thing you're looking at. Okay? And if you're using a compass, the bearing's going to be a magnetic bearing. So, if too many things. Okay, so here's the shoreline, and here is a lighthouse, and over here is a, let's say here's a power station with a big smokestack. Okay, and those appear on the chart. Okay, you can take a bearing and using the compass rose that you have on your plotting sheet, or using the compass rose, which is simply like a circle with the degrees marked out, the representation on a chart, and there's usually 2 or 3 of them on the chart. Okay, you can determine where you're at. Now, I'm going to kind of do a crude version of that. Could somebody hand me that parallel rules I have right there? It should be
Here, you're right.
Ready?
What? Oh, okay. Compass, thank you. You got one of mine. Can I borrow that? Oh, you know what? Oh, okay. So, put this down here for now. Okay, let's say on our chart there's a compass rose. Okay, and I'm just going to, and typically on charts, there is often, well, often, not all the times, there's a true rose and a magnetic rose. But I'm just going to say there's a magnetic rose. Okay, and let's mark this here at 45 degrees. Let's mark this here at 100 degrees, right? And the reason I did that is, let's say we're out here, and we aimed our vessel at the lighthouse, and the compass read 100 degrees, okay? And then we aimed, and then we turned and we changed course and aimed towards the smokestack, and it said 45 degrees. So, take this down. All right, so I go to my compass rose, and I go to 45 degrees with a parallel rose on this really slippery surface, and I maneuver it up, and I draw a line. All right? And then I go to the same compass rose, and I come here to 100 degrees, right? And I maneuver to the lighthouse, and I draw a line from that. Okay? That's my position, right? Fix right there. Mind if I hold on to these for just a minute? Thank you. Okay. So, I'm not going to go into this too much, but if you don't have, if you don't have the magnetic rose, then you're going to have to make the change between true and magnetic by calculation, so you can use the true rose. And I'm not going to go into that too much, but just remember this. If the variation is east, magnetic is least, okay? So, you heard Bob say a minute ago, the variation currently is about 11 degrees east, all right? So, 100 degrees magnetic is what? It's 89 degrees true. No, excuse me, no, it's not. It's 111 degrees true. It's less by 11 degrees. And 45 degrees magnetic is 56 degrees true. Okay? So you can make that calculation, and you might have to do it quite a bit. But not so much in this course, but I'm going to go through one little exercise, and that involves yet another thing that affects the compass. The vessel itself has its own magnetic field. Could be that it's made out of metal, the ship, it could be a steel ship, or it could be that the engine is right underneath the binnacle, and that's got a lot of iron in it. Or it could be got a really cool Bose speakers right next to the helm station so you can listen to music, and that is a magnetic influence. Or it could be, and those are all fixed places, and then the other things you don't want to do is you don't want to stand next to the compass with a big flashlight, poked under your belt, or any other magnetic influence nearby. But the ship itself has its own field, and as you go around the compass, there will be a difference between magnetic and what the ship is reading, and that difference is called deviation, not variation, but deviation. And it's a similar rhyme. If the deviation is least, then the compass is. If the deviation is east, the compass is least. So if the variation is east, magnetic is least. If the deviation is east, the compass is least. So another way to do this is to use T, V, M, D, C. If you want to know where to remember that, timid virgins make dull companions, okay? So true, variation, magnetic, deviation, and compass. So for east, okay, it's less going this way. For westerly changes, it's more. All right? So going to the calculation fund in. Now, how do you know what the deviation is? Well, there is a way to do that, and we might go into that later, but you actually do celestial navigation, and you find out what the direction of the sun is at a given time, and use a device called an azimuth ring or Polaris, and see where the little rod in the middle, where its shadow falls on the ring, and determine if it's more or less than it should be, and that'll tell you if the ship's compass is more or less than pure magnetic deviation would suggest. We're not going to do that right now, but I will go into a little bit later. But you don't always have to do this correction, because sometimes they give you the magnetic rose on the chart. But on all the charts you made, okay, that's all true. And mostly when we deal with celestial navigation, because we're not doing piloting and taking the bearings on things we can see, otherwise we would be doing celestial navigation, you're going to be working in true. But what I'm doing right now is I'm going through some of the principles of coastwise navigation to get to where we need to be for celestial navigation, okay? So a bearing, 2 or more lines of position, if you're looking at them using the ship's compass, you're using a tool that has been affected by magnetic variation and deviation, okay? All right. So there's other lines of position as well. You can also measure it by pointing the boat at it, but you can measure it using the binnacle or compass, or what Susan handed me a second ago is this. It's a hand-bearing compass. You can sight through it and read numbers superimposed what you're looking at. There are also binoculars that have compasses in them, and you can do the same thing with that. Okay? Whose is this, by the way? Okay, Bob, is it okay if we just pass it around?
Sure, go ahead.
Look at it? Okay.
Commonly known as a hockey puck.
Yes, a hockey puck. There are other lines of position you can use. Okay? For instance, if you know what the depth of the water is. Because there might be depth lines, contour lines. And let's say this line is 60 fathoms, which is 300 feet. Then you don't need both of these, right? Actually, if you didn't have this one, right, and you just had this bearing and this depth, that's across the two lines of position, which is why the sounding light is important. If you have a chart that shows the depths, so you can use that as a position. Does that make sense? Again, two lines of position are crossing, okay? Does someone have a question? Okay. Okay, so there's another thing that you can use. Let's go back to our lighthouse right here. Okay, and let's say the chart says that the light on that light is visible for 23 nautical miles. Okay? So you're sailing along and it flashes, it double flashes every 30 seconds. Flash, flash, and then nothing, and then 30 seconds later, flash, flash. So you do a stopwatch, or you watch to time it, 2 flashes, you go, okay, that's the characteristic for that lighthouse. And I could just now see it, so I'm roughly 23 miles. So you could take your compass, spread it out 23 nautical miles, you had a compass with a pencil on it, and draw an arc, and that's another line of position, isn't it? So if you, and if this distance was, this was 23 miles, right? The combination of this bearing and this arc, well, you're on that spot, right? That's another position. Okay, there's one other thing you can do with lighthouses like this. I'm going to do a little bit of erasing over here. Okay, so let's say you're looking at the lighthouse, and here's the water, and here's a boat, and here is a lighthouse. Okay, and not only does it say on the chart it's 23 feet, but let's say it says it's 220 feet high. Okay? So if this lighthouse is 220 feet high, okay, then by trigonometry, this angle here, right here, is angle A, tangent of A degrees equals 220 feet over distance. So if you measured that height with your sextant, just like you were doing out there, and you got the altitude, or the altitude of the light over the water, see where you see it breaking on the shore, and you know from the chart it's 22 feet high, and you got a set of trigonometry tables, you can find out how far away you are. Probably more precise than just when you can see it at 23 miles. And of course, at daylight, you're not going to see it at 23 miles anyway. And if your boat is really low, you might not see it then either because the horizon might intersect. But if you can see the shoreline where it's breaking, you can measure its height, and you can get this distance. And say tangent A degrees equals 220 over 23 miles. Same thing. You have this arc, 23 miles out, okay, and the bearing on the lighthouse gives you your position. Likewise, that is a fix. Okay? All right, that's a fix. What about this? What happens when you can't see the lighthouse? When you're so far out at sea, that lighthouse is gone. There's only a few other things out there you can see, and at daylight, there's only one other thing out there you can see. What if, instead of this angle to the lighthouse, up here, whoops, it's the sun, right? So you're now, that is the direction of the sun, you're measuring this angle And this angle to the sun, by a similar kind of equation, can put you on a line, on an arc. Except now it's not this 23-mile arc here. This is a huge, long arc that is so long it goes around much of the world, and it appears on your plotting sheet as a flat line. Everybody on this arc sees the sun at the same altitude. The only trick is the lighthouse doesn't move relative to you. The sun is moving through the sky. Well, really, we're moving, but it's like the sun is moving. So the key is find out where is the sun when you measure this angle. And for that, you got to know what time it is, right? Hence the need for a chronometer, WWD, and all that stuff. Because what your goal is to use the nautical almanac to turn the sun into a fixed spot in the sky, which will give you the meaningful result from that angle. Okay? And it isn't really any different than doing this thing with a lighthouse. Okay? That's the whole concept behind celestial navigation, is turning things in the sky into the equivalent of fixed points the instant you take the measurement. Now, this line is huge. So the problem is, if the sun is there and it's the only thing there, right? Taking that bearing, it's not going to work the same as taking a bearing and drawing a line from a known position on the chart. All you get is that line of position that everybody on it sees the sun at the same altitude. Okay, so what do you do then? Well, the thing is, you're going to need to have two lines of position, right? But only one thing in the sky. So you got to be patient, and you're going to wait for that thing in the sky to move to a different place so that you can take its bearing then. Okay? So two lines of position separated by a length of time. Meanwhile, your boat is moved. Okay? So the sun is here, and then later it's over here, and you measure that angle there, and it gives you another one of these great arcs. But meanwhile, this arc, and we're going to stop talking it, we're going to talk about it as an arc, but really it's like it's a line, and this is a line, okay? Meanwhile, what has happened is that your boat has moved, say, 20 nautical miles in this direction. You're going to take that first line and you're going to move the entire line 20 miles in that direction. And where that crosses, that's where you're at, and that's called a running fix. Okay? Now, you can do the same thing with coastwise navigation. Okay, I'm going to erase this now. Let's start again. Okay, we've got a coastline here. And again, we've got our lighthouse here. And we take a bearing, and we go to compass rose, and the lighthouse is located there, and we draw the line out. Okay, and we know we're somewhere on that line of position when we take our magnetic bearing on the lighthouse. And then what we do is we wait, we go a certain distance, and let's say we go 20 miles on that course. We move this entire line, that 20 miles, and then we measure, we take another bearing, and that running fix is where we're at. Okay? So two bearings taken at different times, where we've got a good guess at the distance traveled between, and we can plot the course we go in between. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just like what we did with the thing with the sun. Now there's a couple other instances I'm just going to go over just with coastwise navigation. But this doesn't apply too much to celestial, but it's good to know anyway. As it turns out, now, there are special types of running fixes. This is the type we just drew is called two bearings that run in between. But there's another one, a special one called a bow and beam bearing. You're sailing along the coastline, okay, and you take a bearing on the lighthouse, and it's 45 degrees. And then you take another bearing when it's exactly 90 degrees. Okay? As it turns out, the distance you've run between is the same as your distance off. Okay? So let's say between, you've gone 20 miles. Well, you're 20 miles out from the lighthouse. Okay? Bow and beam bearing. As it turns out, this of course is an isosceles triangle where the two legs are equidistant. As it turns out, every time you double that angle on the bow, you measure your distance off. So let's say you're sailing along on that course and you capture it down here when it's 30 degrees, and then you get it here. I didn't do that too well. You get here when it's 60 degrees. Your distance between that you've run, let's say that's 20 miles, is once again your distance off by doubling the angle on the bow. Geometrically, you created an isosceles triangle. This isn't so applicable to celestial navigation. It's the kind of thing you do in coastwise navigation. Okay, there's one other thing I'm going to tell you. It doesn't pertain much to celestial, but it's important to know it anyway because it's very useful at times. As it turns out, if you had three things to measure, okay, we've got a lighthouse here. Here we've got a power plant or smokestack. And over here we have a water tower, okay? And those are the positions there, okay? You can take your sextant and you can hold it horizontally, so instead of bringing the sun down the horizon, you can superimpose the image of the lighthouse over the power station and measure that angle. And then take another measure, you superimpose the power station over the tower and measure that angle. Two horizontal angles, okay? Or you could just take bearings and do that, okay? But you measure the angles in between. And then, if you did this, hang on. Could someone hand me, Eric, could you reach that?
This one?
Yeah, that one right there. Just what I was looking for. Okay, thank you. Oh, okay, so this is a 3-arm protractor. And if you measure those angles, and you set them up, right, with the angles that you measured, and let me put my pencil down here. You maneuvered the arms so that they all, well, I'm kind of futzing this here, but anyway, if these lines all touch each of the three things on the chart, where they converge is where you're at, based on those two horizontal angles. Okay, so it's a pretty cool trick way to get a position really fast. Doesn't have anything to do with celestial navigation, but you know, if you can see three things, measure the angles between, these guys are pretty cool to use.
Do you do the same thing in like celestial navigation using like planets or stars maybe?
Well, you could, yeah, you could do that, but actually you don't really quite use one of these.
Well, no, but
because they're
the same principle in like with the angles.
well, that's the conversion of two horizontal angles. In a way, that's true. It's just that the thing works really well to put these things on the chart, which you can't do with the stars so easily. It's two horizontal angles, but you're not measuring the angle between one and another. The only time you're really measuring angles between things in the sky is the really rare instance if you were like well advanced in this and you were using the lunar distance method. Because then, which we're not going to do, then you measure the angle between a star and the moon, and then you right away measure the altitude of the moon. All right? And so you're measuring it between the moon and the horizon, and the moon and the star. So that's two angles. They're not horizontal, but there you go. Anyway, so it's kind of a cool device.